We really want to facilitate a discussion now, and I'm here in place of my boss, Paul Shannon, who's run sessions like this before, and it's worked really well. And he ran one in our office a couple of weeks ago to show me the ropes, and I came in the room this morning and we have a lot more tables, so it would have been a different arrangement if we didn't have all the tables. So we have a fishbowl in these 4 chairs here, and not all of the only people that speak are going to be the people in the 4 chairs, but we want to encourage you all to come up, and in order to facilitate that, there'll always be an empty chair, but the minute someone sits down, the discussion stops and someone needs to vacate and make way for that person. So we need some, first of all, I think we should all draw upon the questions that we already have. We've listened to many great presentations this morning. We came with ideas of what we'd hope to get out of the session, and I think some of that may have been covered this morning. You may want more information about that. So I just want you to take a minute really to just write down a couple of questions or sort of aspirations, hopes, or obstacles to getting more involved in open source. So please do write a couple of questions, because I'm going to try and help you all to sort of come out of your shell a bit for those that might not be willing normally to come forward, and I'd invite everyone to at least participate sort of once during the discussion. You could just step in, ask something, and then step away. So just take a minute now to just ask a couple of questions and write some things down. Yeah, that'd be great. Okay, you can continue to write questions throughout as they occur to you. I just think it's important that we draw upon those things, and if they're not covered at all, that you make sure that they do get covered during the course of the discussion. So the first thing I want to do, I want volunteers for people to occupy the first 3 seats, and if we don't get 3 volunteers shortly, I will nominate. So. I'll remind you of the rules as you sit down, just so that we can kick it off, and it'll be my role to just facilitate the discussion and make sure no one's speaking without sitting down.
Sitting down to ask one of our questions?
Yeah, you can do that to kick off the conversation. Okay, so we have 3 of the seats occupied. I find this works best when we always keep 3 seats occupied, so even if you're not participating in that very discussion, just hang in there. You might have an idea, and then as someone sits down, then you can fight over who leaves first. If you're really uncomfortable, if there's 2 people coming forward, then 2 of you can vacate. So why don't we start? Are there any questions about the format here? Oh wow, yes. Okay, so why don't we start with your question?
I'm Bill Kasdorf. I have a short question and a long question. So I'll ask the short one first. Forking, a good thing or a bad thing?
So does anyone have a response to that?
Do you know what I'm asking of that question? That with open source software, I mean, I'm very active in the standards community, and one thing we're deeply opposed to is the standards forking and competing with each other, right? Whereas with open source, people can do what they want to do.
So someone could vacate a seat and then,
So I think there are lots of ways to answer that and lots of opinions, but I think in general there's a goal that that if there is a forked version of the open source software and changes and additions get made, that they get contributed back to a shared resource when possible. And I think it's really different from standards in that way, that you can have many copies of a code base and they all can work perfectly well and they can even be different from one another, and that's okay. But I do think that the more communication is involved, the more the community participates, the more you understand the variations and the community can benefit from them. But there are also instances in certainly that people have taken it and added something proprietary to make it their own and make it a differentiator from another platform. And again, I think there's a use case for that that isn't evil. But I think that if it's understood and they again are able to contribute back to the core open source project, that's important. Also, sustainability for open source is dependent on people understanding that open source doesn't mean free. You know, everyone needs to we pay our developers. We do not ask for voluntary software development. And I don't think that we would survive, our code base would be as good as it is if we did. So there is also this idea that acknowledging that you're using the software and contributing even a small amount back to the open source project is how the sustainability works. So taking the code and running with it robs the open source project of the opportunity to at least have some form of in-kind or monetary contribution. That was long, sorry.
Great answer to a short question. Thank you.
So my name's Charles Watkinson. I'm from University of Michigan. And Ted and I have been meeting at SSP meetings quite a lot. And my background is in publishing archaeology, and Ted is in geophysics. And we find remarkable similarities between some of the use cases of our communities. And with open source software, these very modular approaches seem to open up opportunities to think about cross-disciplinary communities of practice. People who particularly value things like ground-penetrating radar, for example, and the imaging of that. And I found it very hard to find a lexicon for talking about that. Communities of practice that are not disciplinarily based, but are based on common needs, often satisfied by software tools. And I wondered if anybody had found a good way of talking about those kind of cross-disciplinary communities, or was starting to sort of rediscover unexpected links between one community over here and another community over there.
Yeah, that's a good question, Charles. Ted Bakamjian, Society of Exploration Geophysicists. And if I could try to add to your question, I think has the process led to interdisciplinary gain in research and output? I think it's an excellent point. And I don't know the answer. I just think it's a good question. I was going to ask a different question. We have a very vibrant wiki for applied geophysics in our society, and I noticed that the Wikimedia Foundation was I'm not sure what their role was in the joint roadmap, but was curious if anybody had an answer to that particular question, what their participation is in that role, and whether they're doing anything with Wikipedia to advance research.
Answer that. First, I just had something popped into my head, which was communities of need, which might be one way to look at that. So Wikipedia has a project many people are familiar with called Wikidata, which is essentially taking the entities and relationships and kind of structures of knowledge that originated with Wikipedia and making them accessible in a kind of machine-readable, computable way. And Wikidata has quickly become one of the most powerful and important things in science and research, because of its kind of self-organized ontology of knowledge that represents. So that really represents I think, the really interesting potential part of their collaboration in the joint roadmap. That plus, their leadership in other areas like the Open Citation Project and so forth. Their Wikipedia represents a place that scientists come to learn and so forth. So that's also another important piece. Yeah.
At the risk of being like that radio show when you answer the question from previously, I was thinking about what Charles said. I'm Dan Morgan from UC Press. About seeing needs and interdisciplinary connections and things like that. So yeah, I think like many of us here, I've been a publisher for 16 years and I've worked with lots of academic communities who sometimes don't see the similarities between themselves. So I think there is a huge role for publishers, or it doesn't have to be a publisher, but it just anybody who can facilitate these discussions and really help communities who think in terms of a community and don't really necessarily realize through no fault of their own that there is a huge similarity between another community, but perhaps they're talking about it with completely different nomenclature. I work a lot in kind of the transparency scene, and so I see, I've seen a lot of connections emerging between medical research and psychology. Again, there is an inherent connection, human and health and stuff like that, but perhaps it's to do with the way findings from medicine and psychology get overblown in the media that has been led to some of these, slightly shaky science underpinning some of the inherent norms or beliefs that, the truths that those fields have, believe they've discovered. So it's really just an direct answer to your question, Charles. I think we as publishers or in the scholarly communications community have to play the role of facilitators to see these connections. And that is, again, one of the value adds we can play.
I'm Frances Chang Andrew with the Rochester Institute of Technology, and I'm a librarian, and I'm kind of taking this in a different angle. So in a lot of these publishing processes, it looks like you have a lot of workflows for different publishing systems. Has anyone, or are any of them looking at incorporating institutional repository workflow deposit into the workflow, or to help facilitate authors? Because one of the issues we have is that authors go through this whole editorial process and then it stops, and getting them to deposit into the IR is tricky because they're kind of far removed from it. It takes extra time. They don't have the time for it. So anything kind of to include that in the workflow.
I can answer from the perspective of PKP. So our software we are actually based, the project is based out of a library, so we have the library community very much in mind. We have made a point of sort of, again, trying to work with standards that exist, so OJS both can deposit using the SWORD protocol into IRs, and can accept, we can sort of even do submission sort of from an IR into, and inputting into an OJS instance is sort of one of these things around trying to make sure that we are working with the standards that the library community has already adopted. It's a tricky issue around creating the culture around, for example, adoption of open access through institutional, when you have sort of policies to allow people to deposit, and sort of this leads to my sort of question, which is a question sort of for everyone, but going off of the previous, is what is the role of people that are building tools or are publishers in shaping and changing the culture versus responding to the community needs? And so I was curious sort of what people in the room here sort of see, because from our perspective, we are very much actively trying to, through our technologies, change the way that the way that communities interact with one another, the kinds of things that they publish, what they do. But wanted to put the question out there for people working as publishers or librarians. So if you're shaping tools and building tools or providing services, how much are you trying to do what the community wants versus how much are you trying to change what the community wants?
Does anyone want to come forward on that? Or?
I can. So a couple responses to both. So at CDL we have both an institutional repository that's for publications as well as a data publishing platform, Dash, that I was talking about. a lot of what we as institutions talk about is, needing help and support in capturing the outputs from our university. So we pay a lot of money to organizations to clean up information from metadata records to then sell back to us about what we've created. And then we go chase down what was created and we ask. And so for someone to deposit it, which is as good as it gets right now, but there's a lot of pieces to that need to be retrofitted. One of the expectations of the project that we have with partnership with Dryad is by putting a university-based tool or a kind of researcher-based tool into the publishing platform or into the publishing workflow, we could actually start to then, through community discussions and workshops, be able to determine what is it that libraries or other entities would want. So, for example, when a journal article is published at a publisher and the associating data is deposited in Dryad, sending a notice to that university that there was a data set that was published so that we could, through SWORD or other protocols, actually send it over or do whatever the institution wants us to with that data set. That is what we're hoping will come out of that partnership. But separately, there is this need in this space that we don't have a clean way of identifying our institutions. There isn't there has not been a publishing community adoption of a standard in the way that even FundRef has gotten some, or the Open Funder Registry has gotten adoption. There is no clean way of capturing institution affiliation information. And so there is a project that we have been involved in. I mentioned that we're involved in a lot of persistent identifier discussions that we launched with Crossref and DataCite and ORCID around creating a open CC0 affiliation identifier that hopefully publishers will be able to adopt in a similar way that people have been trying to adopt the Open Funder Registry, so that we can start to get cleaner information quicker, so that we can actually find where all of our stuff is easier. And that, I think that is, we're talking about open source, but I mean, going back to the success metrics idea, I mean, it's not just about building technologies that are open source, it's about building the ethos and the community and the openness. And that kind of openness idea of building an affiliation identifier schema that actually would allow and registry for us to share and cleaner information would actually kind of help with the root of a lot of these problems.
I just wanted to address your point a little bit. So I'm Associate University Librarian at University of Michigan and in charge of Deep Blue, our institutional repository, as well as some publishing activities. And it strikes me that this is one open source community. There's a whole open source community over on the repository side, and what constantly astonishes me is the lack of interest they have in publishing. And it's still this strong bias to viewing institutional repositories as collections, where they're very, very clearly publishing platforms, and the ones that work best are publishing platforms. And I fail to understand the disconnect between those two communities.
That's actually my job, and I would completely agree. It's because libraries love preservation and they love stewardship stuff, and so the data problem has always come from that perspective.
But publishers should as well.
Oh, of course, but I mean, when research data became a librarian thing, it was around the idea of preserving it, so it was retrofitted on top of the preservation. And that's actually we spent a lot of time at CDL just talking about what is data publishing versus data repositories. And we built a platform that was about publishing and sharing your data sets, and less about focused on the fixity checks and the preservation, which is important to us as librarians, but to researchers, they just want to get a citable work.
I'm a librarian at the University of British Columbia. I specialize in scholarly communications and copyright, and I would just push back on that a little bit to say that I think IRs at libraries consider themselves publishers of dissertations and theses. But so maybe we need to just broaden that out a bit. And my question, so I'm more focused on the open access side in general as opposed to open source, but I see them sort of, obviously they're part of a bigger picture. And I note that the International Open Access Week just launched its sort of theme of the year, which is about designing equitable foundations for open knowledge. So I just wondered, sometimes it feels like people create the open source code and then they expect the equity to be produced in the users and how the code is used and not in the production of the code. So I just wondered if anybody who actually creates open source products thinks about equity in the actual production of the code.
How do you expand on that a little bit? What would that look like?
Well, I don't know if I know because I don't
I'll
think of
allow
it
it.
from that. Oh yeah, you broke the rules. I didn't hear that. I don't really know because I don't come at from that perspective. I think a lot of people have talked about equity in their presentations, but sort of once the product has been created, how we can use it in an equitable way. And so that's why I asked the question.
I think it's a really interesting question, and I don't really have a clear answer, but I would say that you can aim for equity in terms of trying to make the code as reusable by anybody anywhere in the world as possible, and by opening your community. And open source is all about people. Open source is people. It's like Soylent Green, and it's all about getting the people in, right? And so you want your community to feel as open as possible and as accessible as possible for people from anywhere in the world with any language, et cetera. I think all of that is and we try hard to do those things, but it's not always easy. I think the question of does open source increase, sort of democratize the ability to publish, is a more interesting one. And I think that a hard one to make a reality, unless you're OJS, who I think has done an amazing job of making the ability to publish, the ability to start a journal, something that's available to everyone. And maybe that's why you came to sit down.
At the risk of answering every question with saying that at PKP, this is sort of what we're doing. The challenge, I think, is what equity or what participation and what inclusion looks like. It has so many different facets that it's no matter how broad or how big you try to think about it, there's always one more angle, that one more group, one more a way of participating, one more set of abilities, or one more sort of set of ideas that need to be included. So it's a never-ending task. And I think that thinking that any technology is going to be able to completely democratize who and how is able to publish is unrealistic. We have tried to, from our perspective, to make sure that we are really thinking about the publishing from the perspective of people working out in very different conditions than the traditional sort of the commercial scholarly publishing that this whole conference is sort of centered around. And so we really are working from the perspective of the global south, from the perspective of scholar publishers, and from the perspective of people working on the peripheries of scholarly communications. And we try to make the tools work for them. And for example, language is one way of at least allowing that level of inclusivity, as saying it should be easy for you to work and publish in your own languages. We shouldn't be trying to push for saying, well, you should be using tools built all around English, and then if you want, you have to do the labor of translating the tools and technologies before you can use them in your own language. And so we have tried to incorporate that, and same with around lowering the barriers for what technologies does it take to be able to publish. Not everyone has a software development team, not everyone has system administrators, not everyone has sophisticated server infrastructure. If you want people to be able to participate, then you need to build tools that work. And we've supported, I think just now, like last year or earlier this year, we dropped support for PHP 4, which was at that point something like so that the server stopped being a recommended version more like something like 8-9 years ago. But we kept it on and we kept supporting it because we knew that the places where people were trying to use our software were not having servers that were upgraded. And so if we all of a sudden drop the requirement, then people would be left out. And so that came at an incredible cost of maintaining outdated things. So there's things that we can do, but I think that requires being, I think as Kristen was saying, it requires being embedded in those communities that you want to include.
I'm Judy Luther, Informed Strategies, prior librarian working in publishing for many years. I forgot my question. But community and SaaS-based systems. One of the questions I've had for Kristen is that a lot of the smaller institutions that are very much interested in this type of open source software aren't able to handle the support internally. We certainly saw that with Digital Commons taking over a large portion of the market, and many institutions had to have the level of service support to make that work for them. And it's great to hear. What's striking me this morning is how important the community is to this conversation, to the development of the software, and to the contribution of the code back to the community. So I'm just wondering how this can be leveraged in a way where the question about contributing the code back to the community is assured, and at the same time there's a layer of services that are spread across a large enough group of institutions actually make that kind of cost-effective and accessible for them.
I'm happy to answer, but again, I think OJS has pioneered a lot of the services around their own, like creating services around their own software, and probably has something to say there. I think there are two different layers of community that we're really interested in. One is the technology community, right? The developers and the UX people and the product people and those folks. And we've been successful in these early days of generating community around the software production. So code is coming from multiple places. It's being carefully vetted before it's committed into the code base, but we are getting actual, like, eLife is building, we did this Word to HTML, they're doing LaTeX to HTML. Like, we're getting real solid contributions. Hindawi is bringing a lot of their math, MathML and all those different things to the table as well. So we're getting real contributions coming in, which I think is an important sort of Rubicon to cross, if you will, because I don't think that's been easy for publishers to do in the past. Then the next layer is, how do you then bring it to market, if you will? How do you serve the needs of publishers who want to use it but don't have those abilities to create code and aren't interested in having their sysadmin and all of that? And PKP has created a services organization for its own technology. We have not done that. And in fact, we are hoping that the community will generate service providers and step into that gap rather than us doing it ourselves. So we're taking a little bit of a different approach than what PKP has done in asking this community to step up and say, where do you see a business opportunity here that you think, or a niche that needs to be filled? And I think, and in how can we help you assemble the appropriate technologies across this ecosystem to make those businesses work? And I think that from our perspective, we hope for multiple service providers across multiple markets, because there will be people in other languages and other areas with specialized sales expertise, or who have a certain kind of customer service understanding that we would never be able to emulate. And I think that with the right we can create a business model that feeds the open source project at the core and keeps the code base maintained and healthy at a relatively modest cost, and creates a lower cost service for most publishers than they currently are getting today because of the benefits of the shared infrastructure. So that's our goal. If anybody wants to raise their hand to become a service provider, please do. And I'll...
Yeah, I think, so two parts, I think, in terms of an answer. One is that we, for many years, resisted the idea of providing services on our own software because we saw it important that people install their own versions of the software as a way of helping build capacity in other parts of the world around also supporting the infrastructure needed to do their publishing. And so we were purposely hands-off for the first 10 years of the project, and we did not provide any services at all. What we then started seeing is that some people really need those services in order to be able to do it. And so then it was a way of where we realized, although we were trying to do it from a good place of saying, we're not going to help you so that you have to help yourself, and then realize that actually some people are not able to do it at all, so we're not fulfilling our mission of greater participation. And the second part is that, and this is that we always envisioned community being about the editors for a long time, and I think this is something that really was when Kristen started with, in the earliest conversations around what Coco was doing. We have come around to realizing that we need to think about the community of the ecosystem of the people building tools. Even when our tools might not even be technologically integrated, that there's a lot of value in creating and fostering spaces like this. And then this is something, again, they credit to Kristen and to Adam at Coco for sort of opening this conversation that we have been doing this for so long, and yet there has never been a community of open source tool builders around. And I think the fact that we're at this level where these conversations are happening is a great credit to them for having moved the whole community along to that.
Step out, but could I say just one more thing before I do? I'm greatly encouraged to see the community growing this large, because it takes a certain level of size to become truly sustainable. And the other thing is that libraries and publishers both, in essence, serve the same audience. They're the faculty, they're the authors, they're the readers, they're the editors, the peer reviewers.
I think the need for service providers is we've already identified one that we don't know if they'll still be there when Libro is ready, but we've already identified one company that we've worked with that have even agreed to volunteer resource as well. So our arrangement has completely changed with them. They're just seeing the sort of future value in that, and I'm sure that you're already having that you have some connections with Xpub as well. But I know, so I'll name drop here, we've worked with a UK company, Digerati, who are multidiscipline, and they they get our ethos and know that everything that they do, that we value them contributing it back, and they seem on board, but they don't have to be in future. They could go their own way. They could fork the project. And but another model would be, so let's say eLife wasn't as active as we are developing on our own software. Let's say we had a reduced capacity of developers, then we could, because all the code is open, as long as someone's familiar with the language and the community is welcoming enough, someone with knowledge of the problem, knowledge of the language, you could hire a contractor to take on that specific problem, package it up, and then hopefully it'll just get adopted into the project. So you wouldn't necessarily need your own in-house team to contribute on a project.
Right.
Yeah.
Which gets to another point. If you look at the biggest, most successful open source projects, something like WordPress, it's being adopted by so many people, and complex WordPress installations require WordPress developers to build, and easy pop-up blogs can be done by anybody in their home. So what's happened over time is an entire ecosystem of WordPress experts has grown up around the software, and you can hire those folks. The originators of the original WordPress open source project are not those people, right? So we at Cocoa, we can imagine Cocoa trained people who are very familiar with the technologies we've built, starting up their own dev shops, or a dev shop that, say, has worked with one of our customers, saying they're going to become experts in that, and then they could become a paid development shop for the technology. And they may come up with solutions that we would never have thought of. So I think, again, you want to breed that healthy and competitive landscape of developers who are able to take things and run with them, service providers, community support. And this is something that, when getting back to this question around the libraries have been using open source from the beginning. They're very smart about that, but they've often brought those things in-house into their libraries and collected them just the way they do with content. And that hasn't bred this community around the open source projects. And I think we have the opportunity now to really rethink the way we want to use open source and really consider the community approach from the get-go. What does it look like for open source to be truly community driven? And for me, the most fundamental part of it, coming from a commercial proprietary platform background, was relinquishing control. I had to realize that you cannot control all aspects. You cannot know where all of the funding is going to come from and where the sustainability models are all going to lie from the outset. And you have to trust that if it is valuable enough, people will want it and will contribute to it and will help it grow and shape. And that's kind of where we are now, and so far so good. But yeah.
I'm going to step away again.
Okay, I'm Rich Lampert from Duty Consulting. We work with societies mostly in the medical area who want to do publishing but aren't really set up to be publishing companies. So just a pitch to future developers or future open source project conceivers. What we're finding among our clients right now is that some of our clients have a tremendous body of intellectual property, but it's a couple of books here, and it's a body of webinars, and it's some white papers, and it's some podcasts. And, finding a platform on which they can publish. I mean, the technology is sort of there, but, when you start thinking about who am I going to send the RFP to, with the sort of motley collection of PDF content and Word and webinar and podcast, there's nothing much out there that's doing that. And I sort of came in here hoping to figure out bits and pieces to put together, and realize that I'm a customer-facing publishing guy, and the technology is certainly making my head hurt. So I'm really looking for someone who's going to tackle at some point that phase of the challenge. It's a comment, not a question, not an answer. Anybody want to respond at all? Are we that strange?
So I had a question about community, and I think it was Kristen who mentioned that we're all sort of scrappy, grant-funded startup type companies where we don't necessarily have a lot of marketing budget to get the word out. So more and more places like Orchid and Coco and eLife have ambassadors and community outreach and community managers. So I just wondered, from the folks who have that or who are in that role, what have you found that's worked? If there are other companies here that have that type of community outreach, maybe we could get some input on that. And yeah, I'm looking at you, Allison.
Sit right here. Thanks. And so I'm actually looking over at Catherine too, because I know she's in the same boat. So in terms of things that work, I think with community, it's really just having a solution to the problem, right? And that's sort of what will drive the people to find you. But obviously there's a bit to be done to get your message out, to inspire people to actually want to find you. So kind of loops back to your comment a little bit, I guess, because there are so many ways of getting messaging out, like webinars and blogs and newsletters and all of those typical marketing and comms tools. So I think it's a lot about leveraging those, but also having a really compelling solution to drive the message forward. So in this case, it's Coco's technology. For you, Catherine.
Sure, yeah. Hi, my name's Catherine Ahern. I'm at the MIT Press, and I'm the community manager for PubPub, which is an open access publishing platform. Started up with the Media Lab that the press has started using for their own OA publications. And for me, I joined as the community manager in September, and our main strategy has actually been to leverage our early adopters as advocates for our own platform. We found that a lot of them have spread the word to other academics or publishers about working with us, and we've grown our community that way. We also, at this point, we're really early on in our dev, but we require everyone to email us directly in order to start a new community within PubPub. All publications are centered within communities. So that opens up our communication channels really early on. They know who we are, they know the people running it, they know who I am, and it means that it's very easy for us to collect feedback from them and to use that in the way that we tinker with our code and our design and so on. So that so far has been most helpful.
I was going to agree, which is I talked a little bit about the challenges of getting researchers to publish their data. A lot of the incentives come from publishers and the workflows and the data policies of publishers or funders. But actually, when we're working on campuses, again, somebody brought up the fact that we all have the same communities. We're all working with researchers and with people, academics. When we were we're trying to get people interested in the idea of data publishing, the idea of creating a citable work that's based around the data that you're creating. This is very often about just the same processes and influence that happens in the publishing world through like editorial board recruitment and management. It's about finding people who are influential in domain-specific communities, getting them involved, talking to them about helping create exemplars, getting them to adopt a platform or a tool, getting them to tell the story. We in a library community very often are like grappling with how do we communicate effectively on our campuses, but the same is true for everybody. You can't come into a space and expect that people are going to listen to you. You have to find people who are already there to help amplify your ideas and your thing, and that's through like adoption techniques and these kind of exemplars through influential people in the space.
So we got about
No
15 minutes left in the discussion. I just invite anyone who has a topic that they haven't had covered, make use of this room, come forward and ask your question or make your comment.
I had a real quick comment about the previous item that no one had, which is that there is a little bit of a misconception about not just open source tools, but also proprietary tools. That a myth that is somewhat perpetuated through these types of discussions, which is that if you buy something off the shelf, you don't actually use something off the shelf, right? You usually are in some sort of negotiation with the vendor that takes a long time, and there's a lot of things that you ask. So I would just say that same type of relationship and that kind of customization is something that happens in open source as well. And that's not because open source is crappy, it's because that's the way relationships and adoptions happen. And I just think that, this idea that there would be something very specific that was created that's open source that I can use and I can just adopt, it's not realistic for open source projects. It's actually it's not realistic for proprietary projects either.
Yeah, just very much, well, everyone just leave me alone here. Sorry, I'll stop coming up. No, just say, I've always found it both frustrating and fascinating that people are willing to pay a lot to a vendor for a particular feature, but they're not willing to go to an open source project and pay maybe a quarter of that to have that exact same feature. Like if OJS or Cocoa or whatever software doesn't do what you want it to do, but you're willing to go to a commercial publisher and pay them a whole bunch of money because it does. It's like you realize you could probably just pay a small amount of that to the open source project and say, I would like this feature. If that feature is going to be useful for other people, then you've just now invested in a whole community. You've just recruited a whole community of people to back up that feature that you paid for. It probably will cost you a fraction of what the commercial version of it would cost. But it's always been mind-boggling. People are willing to invest so much in a proprietary solution. And it's like, it's either that or the open source solution for free without investing anything. And it's like, no, you can actually also invest in open source and you get the same results, but with a whole community behind it.
And you get to keep the code.
Yeah, and the code is there, and other people will also benefit from it. So I just wanted to jump and say that. And I'll get out before I clear the room again.
I'm going to contribute to that. No, it is true, and it reminds me of the early battles with people saying that there's something inherently different between subscription content and open access content, whereas it could be the same content. It's this stuff. These are tools doing the same things, right? And they may have even been worked on by the exact same people. I know various instances of that. And so what I'm, hopeful about sessions like this and, the expansion of sessions like this is kind of breaking down this barrier that there's this real difference in type of product or type of workflow between proprietary and open source tools. And there's some sort of notion that, you can't make exactly the same things. I was in a closed institutional session a few weeks ago where we were talking about Editoria, the books production workflow system, where there was just a couple of faculty people that just could not understand that you were making this, you could make the same books. You could just make a book with it. That it was somehow you were making a special book, a future book, by just using Editoria. It's like, no, it's just a book. It's like a regular book. Yeah, but I still want to print my book out. It's like, yeah, it's... So, I'm not trying to make fun of people, but I'm just trying to say that, let's all of us in here as much as possible try and like diminish this barrier of thinking that there's inherent differences to the content, the quality, the workflow, and what you're doing between all these things. That was not a question.
So I have a completely different question, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I'm Suzanne Catley, Canadian Science Publishing, and I'm intrigued by the idea of decreasing the time to publication by having all of the different, the work done on a browser and having the different aspects of the publication process done simultaneously. And I'm just wondering if there are real-life examples of that happening right now, because I can also see how it could be complicated as well.
So yeah, there are real life examples. Editoria, which is Coco's Book's specific workflow tool, was used, I think, around a year and a half ago to produce a book by our co-founder Adam Hyde, and is really close to being in live use by University of California Press within their monograph publishing program. And so, yeah, I mean, there are real life examples, and one that I could send you a link to or put in the notes. Yeah.
Just to add to that, I think the web is filled with examples. WordPress, Google Docs. People are collaborating around the creation of content and knowledge and using various shared tools all the time. It's just us that hasn't figured out how to make it work in scholarly communication. I mean, this is what the web was built for. And so I think that one of the things that Adam and I thought about when we started Coco was all the things we loved about the web, and then sort of circling the ones that scholarly publishing hadn't really figured out how to use, and all the things we loved about scholarly communication. The emphasis on standards, on the excellence, on how references linked, and all of these wonderful things, treatments of mathematics and figures and tables, and sort of said, okay, how can we get the best of these? We need that real-time collaboration. People crave it now, and they want also, though, the structure and the respect for the content that we've made realistic in scholarly communication. And so we actually need to figure out how to do both those things at the same time. And that's really where our whole everything being done in the browser concept comes from, and why we're not just, say, using Google Docs, other than it's not open source, because we felt like we needed to merge that kind of the acknowledgement of complexity with the real-time collaboration that everybody's doing constantly, every day, all the time now in the way that they communicate. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
I'll wait to see the link.
Yeah.
Okay.
Going back to your question, kind of, and I'm sort of coming third party. Are you familiar with The Conversation? It's like a publishing, yeah. So they're like academic articles, but not quite like through the whole rigorous peer review process, because they're sort of designed to be picked up by like news media. So they want that academic rigor, but for like the layperson. And so a coworker of mine recently published with them, and so she kind of showed us the whole process, and it was that in-browser editing where they have the document, and then it tracks, who did what edits. It's all color-coded. The editor comes in. The authors can contribute. And so that's sort of an example that in-browser, and because The Conversation is, they more towards popular media, the turnaround time has to be really fast, because an event will happen and they want to have an article kind of supplementing that to be up, within the week, because it's still in the public mind. So that's sort of another example of that in-browser facilitated, sped up publication turnaround.
And I think it's a great example. And I think also, PubPub is an example of where people are collecting around content and wanting that discussion and dialogue that, again, the promise of the web was there early on, and then it didn't really work out as well. I think one of the benefits of really thinking carefully about how open source plays into that is understanding that those features and functions may be amazing, and the content may be generating is great, and the discussion may be great, but it may be in a walled garden. And so I was going to say, hypothesis, who's creating the annotation tools around this are going further than just saying it's open source. They're saying open standards for annotations means that conversation can port into others. Did you want to? Because I think it's a really important difference.
That wasn't actually why I came up, but I will second that. And I was lucky enough to be able to present with Jo Adekinji, I think is her last name, from the conversation last year at the ALPS meeting. And so in preparing for that session, I was talking about using Hypothesis as a fact-checking tool for climate change and other issues where misinformation might need to be corrected. So I got to learn a lot from her about the great work that's being done, and I know that they're spreading out. They've got ambassadors around the world working, and I think that's amazing project. So.
I think in the end, that's a service that's being provided that could sit on top of any open source or closed technologies. And so lots of people are building the technologies. The question, and lots of people are creating really interesting and cool services that generate the user interactions that make these valuable. But I think we should be thinking carefully about what kind of infrastructure choices we're making long term. So we've watched what's happened with Facebook's choices around privacy and data, and we've watched what's happening with Google. And I love Google Docs. I use it constantly for things. It irritates me, but I can't stop using it because it's convenient. But Google's owning all my data. So how's that going to feel over time? Isn't that going to be an issue? So if we think about and annotation happening on one site doesn't translate into any other site and can never follow the person around unless you're using Hypothesis. So I just think that these are really important things to think about now before we get too far down and have like a bazillion users like Facebook.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that we have a coalition called the Annotating All Knowledge Coalition, and there's a lot of people in this room who are either members, you can be a publisher, a university, or a tech company, and it's to promote the ecosystem of annotation, and we believe strongly that now that there is a standard around annotation, there's space for multiple providers as long as they comply with the standard, and that my annotations using Hypothesis should be able to interact with annotations made using PaperHive the same with each other, even though we use different email clients. But I'm still bothered by the fact that Rich asked his question about the different types of content, and we didn't really have an answer. Some of us were at the Library Publishing Coalition 2 weeks ago, and I feel like a lot of the presentations there, maybe around the institutional repositories, could actually address that. And so obviously my psychic wave smear got Charles to come up here because I was going to call on you to come up here.
I just wanted to come back to Stephanie's question about equity and values, because it does seem there's a very strong undercurrent of the idea of this being a values-based community. And I wondered what the common values were that you all talked about. And also, I wondered how one avoided being too sanctimonious, especially in a community like SSP, where a lot of the publishers and vendors in the room actually do have values, right? It's not that values are a thing that only non-profit open source communities have. So just a little bit more about that values question.
I mean, just turn it back to you. Don't leave, because ask you did we come across? Do you think as being too sanctimonious or different from the rest of the SSP community? And I think that's the question, because I'm trying to also some of the people that haven't. This is the professor in me. Some of the people that haven't participated in the room. This is a question that I think everyone can come in and weigh in on around. Do you think that are the values that we seem to be espousing collectively here? Do they feel different than the rest of the SSP community or the communities that you belong to? Do you see an alignment? Do you see incompatibility or just diverging conversations there? And so I'm particularly looking at that side of the room where there's a lot of people that maybe these chairs were too far.
How many of you find us sanctimonious? Raise your hand.
I think that we need to be at that corner or two. Yeah. Come on up. Yes. I'll say I was a little bit worried about that because Hypothesis is my first nonprofit and first open source, and I was like, I came from commercial. I'm like, this is going to be different, just like regular people.
Hi, everyone. My name is Beth Cronin. I'm from the Electrochemical Society. As far as values from a publishing standpoint, as we're a professional society, so our value is focused on disseminating the science at the end of the day. We want the funding to go back into the research because in our technical domain, it's about the sustainability of the planet and what is happening in the world, global climate change, energy, transportation, all of that kind of stuff. So our focus as a publisher is really continuing to do that to serve the needs of the research and the science. And for us, it comes down to resources. Publishing is continuing to be an expensive venture, and at the end of the day, our focus is to continue to be about creating an open environment and an open publisher for our researchers at the end of the day. So, we have a huge initiative that people are thinking that we're crazy because we want to also change our business model around our publishing. At the end of the day, we want our researchers to essentially have the ability to access the science and to publish with us for free. So everyone would look, how do you accomplish that? So we're looking to this open source opportunities, and I look at Kristen because we had a conversation a number of months back about, we're looking for, to bring those costs down to do the things that we have intended to do since we've been around 1902. So that's my short spiel of it.
I don't think you can go. So I'm another publisher. I want to echo that. I'm from Richard Gallagher from Annual Reviews. If there's one wider lesson to learn from this meeting, it's the idea of community. I think that publishers, certainly non-profit publishers, really need to learn that lesson as well. And we need to become a community that could become a very powerful ally with your community, I think. And one thing I'd like to take out of this and suggest is that this group tries to get together, and anybody from a publisher who's here, maybe we can try and get a group of publishers to come together and see if we can form a bigger block rather than dealing with you on an individual basis when you've got yourselves organized together as a community, and see if we can become some kind of power block that begin, rather than outsourcing, societies outsourcing their stuff to commercial publishers and so on. Maybe we can provide within our own community services that we can share together as well, and also work with you to provide. It did worry me that the gap is in service providers because we've got our own issues and problems to deal with. We can't be taking on new. Although no service is open the box and it's there, we need to have. At least I'm technologically really inept, and I would be very concerned about us going to a system where we didn't have the kind of support. And it's almost the safety blanket of knowing that there's another 10 publishers working with, or 20 publishers working with Atapon as well. Maybe if we can come together and form a community of sorts, we can really work together and do something bigger.
Just a short comment, if you could, because we're...
I think that's really interesting, and I know there's a lot of people in here that would love to think about how to do that. And it actually reminded me of his, Rich's unanswered question too, which at the very beginning of your question was, there's nobody to issue an RFP to. There's the one soundbite that I had, which I've heard somebody else say recently too, and wondering if as part of our kind of community or whatever, we can think about that entity that can, almost like an integrator. ThoughtWorks comes to mind. They're not the kind of organization I would probably suggest including necessarily in this thing, but organizations that can take responsibility for projects and execute them, but using open source components and so forth is a missing component to some degree of the ecosystem. Thanks for that.
Thanks everyone for your participation, and feel free to continue the conversation. Write up any notes that you've had that are poignant on the Google Doc.
Yeah, so we're winding down in terms of our session this morning, but as Nathan said, we've got now the whole meeting to follow up on these conversations. I will ask our speakers in just a second if you can think of like a key takeaway that you'd like to give the group before we part. I do want to thank everyone for participating in the document and in the discussion, and I will say I could not imagine how this was going to happen when Nathan described it to me. I was like, but I really liked it a lot, and I'm thinking we've got some stuff coming up next week. We've got Annotate in a partner meeting and a team meeting, and I'm thinking it might be a really great way to. It's really clear who's talking, and people did a great job taking turns. So thank you for that. So key takeaways, and I'm going to start with John in the back.
So it would be about when we, as a kind of in society, when we think of open source, we usually think about success in certain ways.
It's off. Turn it on, please. Yeah.
Hello. In the kind of cultural narrative of open source, we talk about success in certain very predictable ways, and one of them is in the actual coding. Especially people who are not in coding, they think like, okay, well, I need a lot of pull requests to be a successful project, or if I'm going to be involved in a successful project. But actually, there's a lot of, like we were talking about before, there is a lot of other motivations for being involved and supporting open source. And one of them is just being open to future partnerships and being available for people to understand what you're working on, so that there can be synergies that you might not even know exist now, but would be able to be made later.
Great. I'm going to go to Nathan because he's got a mic.
I just agree with everything that was said there. It's been really great to sort of canvass all of the different sort of projects and ideas and motivations, and it's just great to be part of the discussion. And I have to say this, it's a really exciting path to travel, the open source. I did it before I joined eLife. I've been heavily involved in open source communities. It's never completely clear what the road ahead is, but it is an exciting one, and it's one where you feel like you're making a real difference.
Great. Juan?
I think one of the things that whenever I get together, all of the groups that are here, I think we see each other at different events, we participate, and every time I do it, I'm reminded of sort of two things. One is that collectively we have a whole ecosystem of tools that it really can. There's nothing in the open. There's nothing missing in terms of components in that from the open source world that commercial publishers are providing, or commercial vendors are providing, that we also don't have some version of. And in some instances, the second thing is that there's some instances where we have multiple versions of the things. And one of what's interesting to me is to see how this isn't a zero-sum game where it's like what open source project is going to come out on top, or what open source project is going to get the biggest adoption. Rather that it's, as we make open source a viable solution and alternative for everyone, then we all benefit by actually changing and moving the needle forward around, saying this is the standard now. We're working off of open source tools. Here is your set of open source tools that are available, which one suits you. But just getting people to be able to consider open source as the possible way forward, that's the goal. That's what I see whenever we get together in these kinds of meetings, realizing that, this isn't a zero-sum game where we're competing with each other. We're all competing for making open source the solution or the viable way forward.
Kristen?
Is this on? Yeah. Okay, so I just want to pick up on this idea of creating a community with publishers who are interested in this, even library publishers, the whole group, because I think that ultimately we can solve any of the problems that have come up in today's discussion if there's some critical mass, right? The service layers, the reliability, the sustainability models, supporting experimentation with new business models. There are all kinds of really interesting problems to solve. And there's no doubt in my mind that a group like this couldn't solve those. And it's obvious. So, I think it's about creating the next set of discussions and keeping that ball moving forward quickly and soon, because, the time is now. The future has arrived.
I have one. My closing statement is really just an extension of what I said when I was in the fishbowl. Our journals are still the same. Like collaborative psychology, whether it uses XPub, editorial manager, OJS, is intellectually the same. Or what we're talking about is like doing things more efficiently, more easily, but let's not presume that there's an in and an out, for this open source project. I mean, we can still compete, we can still have different companies, we can still try and position our journals as better than your competitor journal, but I just think all of this will help all of us.
Thanks. Dan?
Yeah, I wanted to note that in the break, or at the break, that Judy and I had a conversation, and she mentioned just the same gap, but the same possibility in the library world in terms of bringing libraries together who can benefit and use from this same kind of tool set and community approach to solving problems. And so there's maybe something exciting happening here.
Great. Well, thank you guys for a very successful session. I also, in addition to our speakers, want to thank Rich Lampert, who is our SSP shepherd for today. He put in a lot of behind-the-scenes work coordinating. And if you head by the check-in and you see Jennifer Lampier, if you know her, we hit her up for a lot of things as well. So thank them for their work. Just one more thing. If you enjoyed this session today, and you think that you might want to be involved in creating programming for the future, the annual meeting committee of SSP has a seminars subgroup that got together and looked at all the submissions, and we now have a dedicated submission process for pre-conferences, and it's kind of new to have that. So folks who are saying that it was a really great group of pre-conferences and they wanted to go to more than one, thank the folks that made that possible. And again, lunch is up on the 4th floor, and we look forward to continuing the conversations with you later. Somebody's phone is up here.